Here is what President Obama had to say yesterday in his latest salvo aimed at Republican candidate Mitt Romney and his plan to cut taxes on the wealthy.
He'd asked the middle class to pay more in taxes so that he could give another $250,000 tax cut to people making more than $3 million a year. It's like Robin Hood in reverse. It's Romney Hood.
Well, of course, this is nothing new to author Ed Conard. He is Romney's former partner at Bain Capital. Also has become a lightning rod himself this political year as he champions incentives for risk takers, CEOs, and entrepreneurs, basically advocating tax cuts for those at the top 2%. Ed, great to have you back here in the loop.
Betty, thank you for having me.
Of course you think the president is wrong there in what he just said, but look, he was citing the Tax Policy Center, which has been getting a lot of buzz with its study, where they're this nonpartisan think tank, and they've said, look, what they have done is they've examined Mitt Romney's tax plan, and they say that it is going to raise taxes on the middle class.
Well, I think they added a lot of assumptions of their own that aren't in the Mitt plan. I think Mitt specifically said that he wouldn't raise taxes inside of the income brackets by adjusting the deductions. And so they make an assumption that, no, he will raise taxes in the middle class brackets. I think it's a little far-fetched, but I think it's really a name-calling to get at a tougher issue, which is, if we tax income that would otherwise be invested and we redistribute and consume that, is that better for the middle class than investing that money to try to create jobs? I make the argument in my book. It's probably worth $2 to the middle class from investment versus $1 for every dollar they get from income redistribution.
But Ed, I mean, they make this assumption, that's true, about raising taxes, but they make it because they've crunched the numbers on Romney's tax plan, and they say, look, he's going to come up with, I think it was something like $600 billion plus shortfall by 2015. So how is he going to pay for that? I mean, President Obama's plan, of course, is then to raise taxes on the top 2%. But how is Romney going to pay for that deficit without raising taxes?
Right, and what Romney said was he would reduce deductions or find other ways to pay for it without changing the amount of income that's collected by each one of the tax brackets, within each one of the tax brackets.
Okay, let me clarify, because what they say, what this center says in their study is that even if they took out all those deductions, even if they accounted for all those loopholes, you still would come up with a multi-billion-dollar deficit. You still would come up with that. Yeah,
they say there's not enough deductions in order to cover the reductions that he's proposing in the plan. But there would be other things that you could do to solve that problem. For example, they take out the municipal tax deduction as one example, and they go through other deductions and say, well, he'd never touch this, he'd never touch that, he'd never touch this. So there are deductions there that they could do, and you could always have other types of credits and things like that where you just said if you had a certain amount of income you could have a higher rate. I think all of this is really a negotiation. Taxes are running at 16% of GDP. Spending's running at 24%.
Yes.
We're not going to get a big rebound that brings everything back to 18 to 20 like we thought we were going to have for the last 3 years. It hasn't occurred. So taxes are going to have to go up. Spending is going to have to come down in order to get to a closer balance than we have today. Both sides are posturing and negotiating and staking out their positions. They're not going to give away their complete negotiating position at this point in the process.
Well, but Ed, the bottom line, though, is here we are talking about Romney Hood. Romney Hood has now become this buzzword this morning after President Obama cited that in his speech. But that seems to be the issue here, is that we're talking about issues that the president's campaign is putting out. What about Romney and his campaign and the impression that he's always on the defensive? I mean, what is it that's missing in him being able to bring that message out, which is what you've just said, which is, look, taxes are going to have to go up for everybody. Spending is going to have to be cut. But we don't hear that coming out from the Romney campaign as clearly as you might hear coming out from the president's campaign.
Yeah, I do think that the invest and create jobs argument, the economics behind that is a more complicated, counterintuitive economics than let's just take from the rich and give to the poor. That's a very easy thing to understand, and I think ultimately these campaigns get boiled down to very simple things. So here in July or August, when there's not a lot of coverage still of the campaign, I think it's hard to really make the case. But my guess is that when you get to September and October, the issue is really going to come down to, do you think the government, more government spending can grow the economy in the long run, or do you think it's really going to fall to the private sector? And if it is going to fall to the private sector, what things do we have to do to get the private sector to grow fast?
Incent them,
And I don't think taxing investors and successful risk takers is going to turn out to be the answer, and I think people are going to come to the conclusion that that's not the answer. And it's not going to take a lot of underlying economic logic for them to get that.
Okay. Ed, when you see an ad like that, basically, it is the same sort of story, right? Private equity guys are bad. They've created job losses, they haven't added to jobs. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think that business has to make tough decisions at times. Sometimes they have to make a step backwards before they can take a step forward. You know, we worked hard to make companies stronger and grow them faster. Some of our companies were unsuccessful, a small handful, and we'll come back to this example specifically.
Well, do you know personally about this?
Well, in this case, the steel industry lost 50% of its capacity to imports. All the high-cost producers, including that producer, were lost in the process. And Bain's investment was lost. The employees lost their job. The lenders lost money in that process. I don't think you can blame Bain for the fact that 50% of the capacity was lost. But there are cases where we do have to reduce employment in order to grow the economy. And if you look, the vast majority of our companies were successful. Those companies grew 2.5 times faster than the S&P 500, added about $100 billion of revenue over and above what they would have if they'd have grown at the rate of the S&P 500.
Now, I think Romney's campaign response to this was that this all happened after he left. Basically, he relinquished his day-to-day operations in 1999, so therefore this doesn't really count. But is that really the message the campaign should be putting out in response to something like this? Well,
I think if they're going to nitpick everything in his records, then I think it's relevant as to what happened on his watch and what didn't happen on his watch. But I think these are attacks on business generally. Would I like to see Mitt defending business generally as opposed to Bain specifically? Sure. And in some cases, in cases where there's macro events, companies do lose employment and jobs and factories and things like that. And there are other cases, micro cases, where adjustments have to be made. The impression, though, Ed, is that happens more often than it doesn't. The U.S. added 40 million jobs on a base of 100 million jobs since the 1980, a 40% increase. Europe and Japan grew less than half as fast. We have 35 to 40% more hours of employment for working age adult than France and Germany have, and we have accomplished those gains at median incomes that are 25% higher than Europe's, than Germany and Japan. So I don't see how you can look at the U.S. economy and come to the conclusion that happens more often than not. And if you look at the Bain track record, we're more successful than the U.S. economy. But that's the overall jobs picture. I'm just saying that the impression is that private equity comes in and more often than not jobs are lost and they are gained. Yeah, I showed you that our record is better than the S&P 500, but so we've done better than the economy as a whole. Are there some reckless investors that have done worse than the economy? There probably is. I don't think Bain Capital is one of them. Not even close. We were at the top of our industry. And there was a few months ago when all of this was really heating up, and it's sort of coming back up again about the vitriol against private equity. There was talk about how the industry should sort of fight back and kind of counter this image. We haven't heard a whole lot from the quote-unquote industry per se. Do you think there should be more work done? Should more of the leaders of private equity be coming together and publicizing track records like what you just talked about? Yeah, I'm not sure how they can. They're talking about $1 billion campaign here on each side. Probably more than $1 billion. They'd have to come up with a lot of money, I think, to mount a publicity campaign that could offset the negative publicity that we're going to see on business generally and on private equity as the surrogate for business. So do I think all of business, including the Chamber of Commerce and everybody, should be pushing back? Sure, but can they mount a campaign the size of what's going to occur here? I don't know that they can. Although you are on your one-man campaign. Yes, I am. Are those the questions you get most when you're on tour? I certainly get them a lot, yes. I get a lot of questions on different issues, but that certainly comes up. Okay. All right. Ed, great to see you as always. Enjoyed having you. Ed Conard, the former Bain Capital partner and author of Unintended Consequences.